get to, I have a couple questions I prepared for this, thanks to my team. So this is to the panel collectively. And our first question is, on the journey to becoming RTB compliant, what's a top challenge that you've faced or seen so far, and how is it being overcome?
I'll start with that. I'm product manager here at OWL, and one of the things when you look at a new set of standards like RTB is how much of an impact is that going to be having regulatory guidance and restrictions or constraints on our products. The old notion of the toilet seat in DoD, we don't want that to happen. So what we're looking at is using state-of-the-industry technology to minimize how much custom work we have to do, break apart things like protocols and filters and things that are common in the cross-domain market so we can bundle things a lot more effectively. But that's really the approach we're taking, is to have a core capability but have a lot of adaptability based on what RTB is driving us towards.
Does anyone want to add to the journey there? Ken?
Sure. So, is this on? In other forums, I've kind of jokingly referred to raise the bar as raise the price, because there's this sort of unfunded mandate of all these additional costs that are associated with it. As the product manager for Tresys, I got to look at that. What does it cost to hire all cleared personnel? Raise the price, right? We're talking about adding additional requirements every year that add additional cost, and the approach from the certifiers has been, I don't care what it costs, right? It has to be perfect security, which is fine, and it's probably a good philosophy, but customers do care. And so when we've got customers that you've been with for years, they're expecting a certain price level, and we've got to figure out, either we got to sell a lot more systems so we can amortize this cost, or we've got to raise the price. And so, just sort of trying to work through how do we do this in a reasonably economic way to respond to these and to keep getting into long-term relationships with customers where it might take 18 months to sell one of these systems, let alone get it deployed. They're going to be deployed for years. We're all signing up for what is it going to cost to keep the system in play, and we don't know what the requirements are going to be 2 years from now yet. So
requirements gathering is obviously a big part of RTB, so understanding that for the customer, but how to secure that is probably one of the biggest elements from a technical perspective and then a cost perspective, because it does impact that as both ways. Anyone else?
I would say inertia. One of the big challenges right now is the labs are getting up to speed with RTB. A lot of the vendors are getting up to speed with RTB. And all types of organizations are having to overcome the inertia of the way they used to do things and the way they used to think about them. And when you combine all that into trying to converge on a date to get into a lab, I think for many organizations, both on the test side and on the development side, it presents challenges getting their heads wrapped around where do we have to go, what do we have to do, how do we get there, and even within our organizations, getting them going.
All right, so I have another question. So given the RTB requirements are commoditized in the CDS market, what are you doing to make your organization/solution stand out in the crowd? So this is kind of an interesting question because this goes to the product side here of both OWL and Tresys, but is there any comments there?
Sure, yeah. We've spent the last several years basically becoming RTB compliant, right? Working really on the architectures and making sure that filters are put together properly and that sort of thing, which to some extent, to me, has kind of quashed innovation somewhat, because we haven't had the time or the ability, effort to be able to go after some of the other filtering problems that are out there. So, over the next couple years, now that everybody's sort of gotten to the point where we've got a strong architecture that's going to stand up to state-based attacks, now we can go back to focusing really on filtering and these additional data types. So, things like base 64 encoded data, maybe we can stop that from going through, things like that. So that's, I'm hoping that between, the combination of putting hardware in place along with the strong filtering, which is something that Tresys and Al together really bring to this. That the hardware separation is now being mandated by RTB in a lot of cases, and I think that helps to put us in kind of a unique position to deal with that.
Well, RTB is a combination of hardware and software, so there's an element here that's, how do you combine that perfectly as the match to the customer? So there's a lot of different elements that do effectively get there. Any other comments? Ari's going to get drilled next. I got you a special question for yourself.
I'm probably a slightly different opinion on this view. I'm not sure I completely agree with the premise of the question that RTB is commoditizing the CDSs. What RTB really is aimed at is creating a better implementation of security controls, but there's still a lot of places to compete as far as what data types you support, how your system is set up, how it's administered, what mission capabilities that you have. So while RTB is a very common element across all the implementations from a security robustness perspective, I don't think it actually puts all of the guards in silos to say they all look the same. They don't. If you look at the auto industry, every auto manufacturer has to satisfy minimum safety requirements, but they compete all over the place on, capabilities, options, functions, and I don't think that needs to necessarily be different with CDSs just because of RTB.
Good point.
One thing related to the RTB standards is the emphasis on one-way transfer capabilities. And I think that it takes one-way transfer from a niche environment where it's only one particular use case to be able to apply across the board and provide a broad level of competition among all the CDS vendors. So I think that is a key thing from the differentiator of RTB for us is the one-way transfer capability.
All good points. All right, Ari, you're on the hot seat now. He came specially prepared with shorts, and I think he's wearing socks because he's from Florida. So, Ari, special question for you. As a mission end user, what benefits are you expecting from the transition to RTB compliant solutions?
So I think one of the things that we're experiencing from an RTB perspective is, as it stands right now, there's not a whole lot of standardization that I can actually put a finger on to say, all right, this solution matches this solution, so I could actually tell a difference between, as an end user, what am I looking to do, what am I looking to transfer, and which one of these industry partners can actually support that for me. RTB, hopefully, I understand the idea behind it. I think the execution of it could be done, a little bit more like, broad-based with a little bit more specificity, as opposed to a perfect example is that to understand whether we can be supported from an enterprise CDS solution, we're actually asked to do a 30-page survey that takes into account all of our network diagrams and all of our data flows before they could say, yes, we can or can't support you. And after that, if it's a custom solution, they just kick it back to us to then say, all right, well, come back to Boyd Fletcher after X amount of time to then identify whether this is good for us or not. So for me, what I'm hoping is that RTB, for the industry guys, that you guys can help us in a fact where you can tell us, hey, we've already done the discussions with Boyd. We already know what you guys need in order to transfer, unstructured data or what have you, and come back to me to say, we have a solution for you. Because right now, it almost seems that we're working with the vendors hand in hand, which is a fine thing. I don't mind it at all. But I wish that there was more of a standardization where a vendor would come to me and say, here's a solution, no doubt. It's already been accredited, already been through RTB. You're good to go. And let's get rolling, because otherwise we're that much time behind the mission and the mission need in developing a solution to even get there, and then from there, then we can start talking about it. But who knows what the advancement of time is going to do when it comes to what the operational need is going to be 8 months from now, 14 months from now, 2 years from now. So I just hope that it standardizes things for us and gives us like a catalog to pick from, right?
I would assume it's pretty difficult because you have a lot of collection of material to get to the process in order to get it approved, right? So the idea is make sure you have all your homework done to get it done the right way the first time, and that's really the key element, I think, more so. All right, I have another question. So this is to the panel collectively. How do we look at more enterprise-level architectures, and can we apply RTB standards to a larger scale architecture and still have adaptability to address changing mission and end user needs? Because we know that they're never the same after day one. So how does that get affected?
Now, the good thing with the architectures that RTB has promoted is that generally speaking, they're very pluggable, right? There's separating protocol adapter, normalization, filtering, and so adding new filters in becomes an easier process. You look back at, like we've worked on aft, right? Every time you added a new filter to aft, it was you're performing brain surgery every time, right? It was painful. So, but the new architectures, if I want to add a new capability to handle some certain data flow, I should be able to do that. Now the question really is, when the lab looks at this capability and says it's a pluggable filter capability, are they going to certify that as a capability not specific to the filters that are there, or every time you go in with an additional filter, is it going to require more testing? Are they going to say, now, okay, come to me with another $250,000 to test this new capability?
Yeah, one part is doing the proof of concept in the lab. The other is bringing it to the ATO to bring it forward in the mission. And that's really where, Ari, you were mentioning before, getting that prepared for what's there, which is an excellent scenario. Anything else?
Okay. So I think there's two things here. I don't actually think RTB is solving the enterprise problem really at all. The enterprise problem is a different thing. These pluggable filters, that's not really what RTB is meant to do, because when you're talking about pluggable filters, you have all these different vendors making different solutions. You've got to have protocols so they can plug into. RTB is not doing any of that. And vendors are competing against each other. They're not going to build APIs that other people can use unless they're forced to. I'll just go with that for now. But yeah, I think that's actually a real problem. John actually has done some work in this problem. And he started down that path, but there's still more to do.
Do you want to try my microphone, John?
And I might disagree with how John did that, but that's a whole other story.
The pluggable filter stuff aside, which is good stuff, but you're talking about RTB and does it support enterprise? I think at the end of the day, if you boil down RTB to what it is about, which are some core security principles, some core architectural principles, the answer is yes. Those principles map to an enterprise architecture, and they can be very valid in an enterprise architecture. Can you take RTB as it's written, word for word, and apply it to enterprise? Probably not, because a lot of what the RTB, the way it's structured, is centered around a point-to-point concept. However, I do believe that over time, those documents are going to change to move towards the enterprise. But I think the principles in there absolutely do map to enterprise. And I think enterprise right now it's a really hot buzzword with a lot of people not doing a lot of work around it, at least from a CDS perspective. I know some people would disagree with me on that, but as far as an industry-wide perspective, the enterprise people who are looking at that problem are a small set of the overall industry.
I'm a sales guy by nature, so there's customers in here that want to spend their money for our enterprise things, but we'll figure that out eventually, so it's good.
So Boyd put out another document about versioning guidance. And that versioning guidance talks about the things that Ken was bringing up, which was, hey, when do I have to test this? I mean, that guidance is supposed to dictate, hey, if I have a pluggable filter, how easy is it? And at this point, it's supposed to be pretty easy, but that's dependent on the labs having the time to actually really test their framework. And that's a whole other problem. I mean, RTB
absolutely
has a very increased amount of work on labs.
Makes sense. Shawn?
Yeah, the last thing I would say about enterprise is that the RTB currently is about a technology capability, not necessarily an enterprise service. And so the key thing is from a notion of enterprise, is that for an entity to manage the life cycle of the CDSs that are in their environment? Or is it to say, how does a CDS plug into the enterprise services themselves? I think both those views have to be addressed, and currently RTB is not addressing those.
I have one last question before we continue forward. So one more. How are we doing on time? We doing good? You checked. All right. How have you successfully leveraged partners and vendors on your path to becoming RTB compliant? This is a tough question because I don't even understand how we're going to answer this. Ari might be the one that has to generate how to answer this one, but I want to leave it to the panel. Partners, we all have to partner together to do certain things, but there's certain core competencies that we can all do, but we need to leverage together, right? And I think the end user, in this case, the Air Force, if we want to call it, they understand that as well. So there's always a leveraging of what the partnership comes together and what you're trying to solve as the problem. So anyone want to expand on that?
Way we're looking at partners is to fill the gaps. Now, that can be through an acquisition, like has occurred with Tresys, but it's also going to be where there are work with filtering or protocols.
I think it's a merger.
A merger. And actually dealing with the notion of there are organizations out there to deal with protocol adapters as core capabilities, tying in with those other kinds of technology, not CDS technology, but enterprise service technology, I think is a key area how we can make use of partners to get us down the RTB roadmap.
Anyone else? Ken?
Yeah, I would just add, it's one of the RTB things is having redundant filtering, and so dealing with our partners that are building the filters and being able to make sure that they're responsive. And for a while there, they weren't. And I think I do want to say both Oracle and Peraton have really stepped up their game in terms of being responsive to issues. As we've gone through testing, I know, Nteligen's done kind of the same thing. We've been finding lots of issues. The CDS market is not necessarily where those guys are really focused. They're more focused at, commercial, releasability of information and stuff. So the things that we do to their products aren't necessarily what they expect. And so when we find problems, it's been very helpful that they've been responsive to those. They put out patches in a reasonable manner, and licensing is always an issue with all those guys, and so working through that has been important. But yeah, I'd say all that filtering stuff is.
Yeah, there's a lot of focus and there's a lot of element here, and thank you all for participating. I'm curious on Ari's comment on this, because it's never just one vendor, right? It's usually a combination of things, and curious from a partner mission perspective, how does that affect what you're looking at? Because you're working with multiple parties sometimes.
So I think it's going to take a little bit of a change of dynamic as far as a little bit of like cultural stuff goes, because one of the things on another scale, not just cross domains, right? Because this is kind of prevalent everywhere, is how does one industry partner, when you're saying that this is a huge problem for the DoD, have the incentive to where it's no longer just monetary based, because the compromise of data or the inability to transfer data, thus like stunting mission, is going to cause a huge problem on us being able to execute something, right, at the front end. When does that become more important to where it says, you know what, I'm going to put everything aside like you're talking about. There are different core competencies in each of these industry partners that I wish I could just kind of extract out and then say, all together, this makes a comprehensive solution for us to be able to manage data the way we need it to. The merger between you guys and Tresys is outstanding, I think. There are other companies, like, all the ones that were at our industry day, right? ForcePoint and stuff like that. How do we combine those different pieces and where the incentive for everybody is the good for the gander instead of what's good for the goose, right?
Yeah, good points. On behalf of Owl and Tresys, we're going to conclude our session. If you guys, anyone in the crowd has a question, we're willing to buy you a drink. So you got to make sure you come ask us a question when we break. So if you have any questions, hunt one of the panelists down. If you didn't hear any of those questions and want a repeat of what it is, they'll be happy to address that as well. So I know on behalf of Owl, Bob, the Tresys team, all of us together, we appreciate you all being here. And we'll see you at our next Cybears event as well. Thank you for being here.